Hey, everybody. It is Sunday, and you are tuned into the Spotlight series. I even got a haircut for today, so I hope I'm looking okay. Um, I am Zach Ritter. I'm the Associate Dean of Students at Cal State Dominguez Hills. Um, I have the privilege and pleasure of doing the Sunday shows, and Joe Brooks, who's the director of Community Works Institute, does the Friday shows. You should definitely check those out. Go to communityworksinstitute.org to find out more information about what Community Works Institute does, which is bringing the classroom to the community and the community to the classroom. They're all about storytelling. We're all about ethnography, having students tell their stories and the stories of their community from their eyes, ears, and mouth, rather than having someone else tell it for them. And there's institutes always coming up in the summer, in the winter, for professional development opportunities and DEI experiences for your K through 16 educators. So check out communityworksinstitute.org. I also have the distinct pleasure of being here with Gabby Kirk. And it's gonna be fun because we don't know each other very well, but I saw Gabby on a discussion through USC about ethnic studies curriculum. And I was like, oh, damn, this person's dope. I have to have her on the show. So it's just going to be an organic conversation. And I love what you say on your LinkedIn page, whereas like, I recently had this epiphany about my life. And while I may not be a visual artist, actress, or musician, I still consider myself a creative person. And like, hashtag me too, like high five, this is me too. Not that hashtag me too, sorry folks.
No, we knew what you meant, yeah.
Me as well.
Yes.
My apologies. Human beings are my medium and communities are my canvases. I like that a lot. I feel like I vibe with that. Human beings are my medium and communities are my canvases. I aim to empower others, especially youth, through experiential learning to forge a path of social justice. I excel in environments which give me new challenges and allow me to meet new people on a regular basis. I love that. You are a PhD candidate. You are more than that. You're a teacher, you're an educator. Tell the folks about Gabby.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Zach, for having me here today, and to everyone at Community Works Institute for hosting these conversations. Calling in today from Oakland, California on the Shawniloani lands, not far from lands where I was raised. I grew up in the Bay Area in San Jose. So a long time Californian, and it's really great to be here. Yeah, I am, as you said, a PhD candidate in geography and with a designated emphasis in feminist theory and research at the University of California at Davis. I'm also an alum of the UC system. I went to Santa Cruz for my undergrad. So I'm California public schools for, we'll stop counting how many years I've been in school now, but for all of them, K through 16 and beyond. I have been an organizer, particularly for justice in Palestine, for about the past decade, as a grassroots member of Jewish Voice for Peace, as well as supporting groups like Students for Justice in Palestine at my campuses and others around the country. And recently have been doing some research, writing a series of articles about the fight for ethnic studies in K through 12 schools in California. The event that you mentioned, I was speaking about my research on the importance of Arab American studies in particular, and also what ethnic studies and critical race theory, very hot button term right now, can teach Jewish studies and American Jews, white American Jews like myself, about social justice and about our own community as well. And I also, my own research is in environmental justice, looking at environmental justice issues in Palestine, Israel today, and questions of sustainability. So that's the grab bag.
Yeah, no, I love it. There's a lot there. So let's first go with Ohlone Land. My friend told me about Jews on Ohlone Land, which is like progressive organization trying to not only raise awareness to Native American genocide and Native American land that we all are on, but also saying that land acknowledgements are a nice start, but if they're not attached to reparations or a land tax or anything like that, that it's more performative. What could and should our listeners be doing, K through 16 educators or whomever, if they want to acknowledge the land that they're on? Are there other things in terms of like money exchange or power exchange that they could be doing?
Yeah, so Jews on Ohlone land, good friends of mine. Huge shout out to Ariel Lucky, Rabbi Dev Noily, good friend of mine, Leo, who are major organizers of Jews on Ohlone land. Yeah, what I've learned from them is the kind of how one roots acknowledgement and reparations for Indigenous sovereignty when one is a diasporic people. So how do we as Jews not deny our own like diverse ancestral connections to different land-based practices, but also not to like appropriate or romanticize Indigenous peoples or Indigenous sovereignty as something that's like stuck in the past, this ancient earth-based practice that like is, the pictures that you read about in picture books or that you saw as a static thing at a museum when you went to in 4th grade. And so I would say that for educators in particular, the question of how do we work with youth to ask them, what does Indigenous sovereignty mean today? That word sovereignty is kind of what my dad might call like a $10 word, a big SAT word. And it can mean a lot of things, right? It can mean things like building a nation state, right? Like one that has like hard and fast borders. But it can also mean a lot more kind of popular and collective ways of being in place. And of being and caring for each other and for the land and letting the land care for us. And I think that all sounds nice in practice or nice on paper. And what does that mean in practice is, I think, a really good question. So I feel very lucky to live in the Bay Area, in which we have the leadership of the Sogorea Te' Land Trust, which is where Jews on Ohlone land takes its direction from Lisjan and Ohlone people. And we have an initiative in the Bay Area to pay Shumi land tax. Anyone who lives in the East Bay is asked to pay, and there's a kind of calculation based on whether you rent or whether you own property, how long have you lived here. And the thing is with that, though, is that payment is actually still just a baseline. It's similar to how in our collective society, for instance, everyone is legally required to pay taxes. That's not the same as going out and making community change. That's just the social contract that we have with each other. And so I think that the next question is, at least what I'll say in the Jewish community, is a larger question of like, how do we live ethically as guests on someone else's land, while also knowing that like this is our home in many ways, particularly as a diasporic people for whom, and we can talk about this, calls to go back to a different ancient homeland are themselves fraught and also tied into systems of dispossession. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you Sunday afternoon, we're going there, we're doing it, and I love it. And so let's go there. We're here, so let's keep going. I too am, a diasporic person, and my dad's a refugee, and mom's second generation, both Jewish. So, okay, you worked for, Jewish Voice for Peace. We are in a moment, we are in another crisis moment in kind of this cycle of violence. From where you're sitting and from the work that you've done, what are you seeing play out in this moment?
Yeah, maybe I'll answer that. You were talking at the beginning about how CWI tells student stories, and I kind of want to think about a story from when I was a student about 10 years ago, first getting into Palestine solidarity work, and then I can kind of say why that I think still matters today.
Yeah.
So about 10 years, 10 or so years ago, a little bit more, I was an undergrad, and I started becoming, I had just been this white Jewish girl who grew up in the suburbs, pretty typical suburban California life, had very few interactions with any type of kind of state authority. And when I got to college, the University of California started after the 2008-2009 financial crash, public education was gutted with major austerity measures around the world. And students at the University of California rose up, students in London and Montreal around the world, and were met with police brutality. I was pepper sprayed. I watched faculty and friends be beaten. This was us expressing, collective free speech rights. And that was the first time that I kind of realized, like, oh, the police care more about protecting this like administration building than they care about the students who are the ones who the building exists to serve us. And that started getting me questioning, like, what are the systems of the state in place for it all? And in 2010, there was a flotilla of activists that tried to break the Israel's naval siege of the Gaza Strip, and Israel attacked those activists. And then this IDF spokesperson came out and said, well, everyone on those ships were terrorists. And I was 20 years old. It was the first time I was like, wait, maybe they're not telling the truth. Maybe sometimes states can lie to you about what they think is going on. And as a Jewish person who had been to Israel twice with my youth group in high school, I had never really thought to question anything I had been taught. And that week I walked into the quad at my campus, and there was a table set up by Palestinian activists. And I went up to them just to ask what was going on. And I met another student who was like, well, I'm Palestinian and my family's in Gaza. And it was the first time I was a full grown adult that I had met a Palestinian, or really even anyone. And to me, the reason I bring that up 10 years later is because I think what we're seeing this moment of collective resistance in Palestine, that a lot of people have been saying we haven't seen something like this since 2014, since 2000. You have Palestinians all over the world, but particularly in all parts of what is now Israel proper, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Gaza, in all the areas that Palestinians live, rising up and being met with immense state repression. Today, I would say that most young people hear a lot more from Palestinians than I had the chance to 10 years ago. And that is because of the active, nonstop fighting of Palestinians in Palestine and in diaspora, including Palestinian Americans, to have their voice heard. So the fact that it took me having to like leave the house and go out into the world to meet a Palestinian, I'm hoping that more and more youth today do not have to go and seek to unlearn what they were taught, and more instead are taught about questions of justice for all people, and questions of liberation for all people from the beginning. Because I'll say that unlearning process is quite sad and alienating, and is the kind of thing that makes one lose family and friends, which is really painful. But what I'll say that I think what's going on today that feels hopeful from what I've heard from, not to speak for them, but to just like kind of share back what I've been hearing from a lot of Palestinian friends, is that there are chances. They have been fighting for their stories to be centered in their own words for decades. And we are seeing Palestinians on CNN, on MSNBC, and particularly because of social media, being able to share out, this is what is happening to us and to our family and friends directly, not mediated, not spun through a news article. There's still a long way to go in terms of like getting coverage that doesn't just either focus on two sides, say, oh, both sides are at fault, or that kind of still demonizes Palestinians as terrorists. And we can talk more about why Arab American studies matters to talk about racial stereotypes. But what feels hopeful in this moment is that I think a lot more young people take for granted that, of course, we should speak out for justice for Palestinians. And even when I was younger, that was not taken for granted, even among progressive anti-racist communities. You could be doing work on almost anything, but except for we used to have a phrase called PEPs, PEPs, Progressive Except for Palestine, which was like huge swaths of the progressive left who would speak out. But when it came to Palestine, like felt like they couldn't say anything. And I think that we're finally seeing a sea change in that, which feels amazing, but not to get my hopes up too high.
I've never heard that phrase, PEP, but it reminds me of Dr. Mark Lamont Hill's book, Accept Palestine. And maybe it's obvious, but maybe it's not. For K through 16 educators listening, why progressives or liberals cool with all of the things, but then when it comes to Israel-Palestine, why is that still such a thing? And also, how do we, when we have these conversations, when we tell these stories, people's identities are wrapped up in countries and nationalism, and it's difficult to separate the two. So then when you're critiquing a government, you're attacking me, and now I'm going to punch back at you. And then we revert to this kind of, not the thing like there's good people on both sides, but like, you know, well, there's like all different sides of this, but we don't talk about power and power imbalances. So I don't know, how do you handle folks that maybe come at you and say like, you know, you're a self-hating Jew, and I've been called this stuff too. You're a self-hating Jew. You're turned against your race. You're all these things. What do you do when you talk with those folks?
Yeah, I'm gonna grab. I never do this. I never pull the book prop off the shelf. But I promise cool. It's organic because they're right here behind me. I really recommend this book. It's an incredibly readable book from an academic press, which is rare. Our American Israel by Amy Kaplan. May her memory be for a blessing. She passed away from cancer very soon after her final book came out. And what this book does really well, you can see how much I bookmarked it, how much I love this book. What this book does really well is unpack how American culture, not Jewish culture, but how American culture has been so invested in the state of Israel as a kind of buffer outpost for US imperialism in the Middle East since its founding. A lot of that has to do with Christian Zionism, with ideas of the end of the world will come when all Jews go to Israel, and that will then bring about kind of like the return, the end times revelations, the Left Behind kind of series of books and movies. Many American politicians have been heavily invested in that. The largest pro-Israel lobby in the US is Christians United for Israel, CUFI, which is an evangelical Christian group. The fact that Trump was the one who moved the US embassy to Jerusalem absolutely has to do with that. And this is a deeply anti-Semitic ideology. The idea that all Jews must leave where they live and could not live in happiness and safety in anywhere in the world, but like all must move to Israel. And that anti-Semitic ideology goes back quite far. In my own dissertation research, I have been studying kind of how California-based scientists at the University of California in the turn of the century, when during the British Mandate period, in the early 1900s, had very Christian ideas of Israel, and that's kind of what pushed them to support this state. So I'd say that the first reason that Americans of all backgrounds, why it's difficult to talk about Israel-Palestine, even if you're progressive on other things, is just because of the way that Christian hegemony in the US and the way that ideas of US dominance in the Middle East, particularly for any of us who have lived through the decades of endless war that the US has been waging in the Middle East. So I would say that that's the first thing to point to, is to ask how Israel as a client state serves the same interest of war manufacturing and military industrial complex. And so then that has very little, if nothing, to do actually with Jews or Judaism, right? That has to do with systems, as you said, of power and of global imperialism that we know the histories of, and we can name and we can fight, and as we would be doing when we're fighting any form of war and militarism at home, including, for instance, like against organizing against police militarism. So that's the first thing I would point to. And again, I'll just hold this up one more resource because it was such a wonderfully readable book. The second thing I would say specifically as a Jew, to anyone who's either listening who is themselves Jewish or has Jewish friends and family, and the kind of things like, I don't know how to talk to them, or like, I want to speak up, I'm worried that my Jewish friends or colleagues will feel attacked, a state, I'm looking up at a Howard Zinn quote that I got in undergrad that hangs over on my wall on a print that a student made. We must not accept the memories of states as our own. Nations are not communities and never have been. So even when I have many people that I love and value who live in the land of Israel, Palestine, even for those of us, we have extended family or direct family, parents, grandparents, cousins, sisters, that the people are not a state, that our people have been a people for a very, very long time without a nation state. And the idea of nationalism is an incredibly new idea in human history, right? Like, we know this as teachers and educators, if any of the social science geography teachers listening in, as a geographer myself, we know that borders are an incredibly new invention, and that they are not that old. There's an Angela Davis quote about prisons that about systems of racism. I'm going to totally butcher this quote, but like, we used to think these things like slavery was as permanent as the sun, and then it ended. So nation states are themselves not that old, and are not necessarily inherent and infinite inventions. And so then comes a more challenging thing that is not just a question for Jews, but is a question for everyone. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism. Nation states are not necessarily the way we're going to solve it. How do we fight racism? How do we fight anti-Semitism as a form of racism? That's a question anti-racist educators can and should be asking themselves, and not just putting it on, oh, well, there is a state that then will protect the Jewish people. The metaphor that I like to use is when there's another school shooting attack, there's often a very like pro gun call to arm teachers. And any educator will know that that is a ridiculous demand. Instead, we're like, we need to do things like reach our students with better mental health, better policies around gun control, et cetera. Why the solution to anti-Semitism is an armed nation state, rather than asking how can we fight anti-Semitism and racism in all of its forms around the world. And so that is where I really think ethnic studies comes in, and why I think that conversation around ethnic studies, which is about educating people critically, is so important to what's going on right now.
So then let's go there. We talked about Native American sovereignty. We were talking about Israel-Palestine. How do we tell us a little bit about your work around ethnic studies, which in my mind just means like non-dominant white landowning Christian male narratives that we've been kind of inculcated with throughout our existence. Tell us about your efforts with ethnic studies in K through 16, and maybe also explore why such pushback to that.
Yeah, so I'll give the brief overview of what happened. I've just, disclaimer, I am not a member of the Save Arab American Studies or Save Ethnic Studies Coalition. I am an ally who has written a number of research articles for the broader public on this fight that's been going on since 2016. So I'll give, if you don't mind, an overview of what's happened so far for anyone who doesn't know what's been happening in California, and then we can talk a little bit more about what we think that means for broader, because it matters outside of California for sure. So in 2016, a bill was passed to build a model curriculum for K through 12 schools to use to teach ethnic studies. Right now, there's also a bill under consideration to make it a high school graduation requirement for all California public schools. And there was a bill that was passed that now ethnic studies is a graduation requirement for the California State University system, where you yourself are situated, Zach. So the ethnic studies model curriculum was formed, an effort was formed to write that based from ethnic studies practitioners. So teachers at the K through 12 level, college faculty from Chicano studies, African American Black studies, Native American studies, and Asian American studies, which are kind of seen as like the big four when ethnic studies started in the late 1960s out of student movements at San Francisco State University, UC Berkeley, UC Davis, universities around the country. Those were kind of the big four named student groups. But there were always other groups working with them, particularly, for instance, since it was a Third World Liberation Front movement, Palestinian and Arab students who saw themselves as part of that Third World Liberation struggle of those students. The model curriculum that was released in 2019 included an entire module on Arab American studies as part of Asian American studies. This is well accepted in the discipline. Arab American studies is housed within Asian American studies at many programs, for instance, very prominently at University of Illinois, where they have some amazing departments, as well as across the UC system. And the backlash to Arab American studies, because Arab American studies dared to name Palestine as a place, to name Palestinians as a community that ended up as refugees in the US because of expulsion when the State of Israel was founded. So the question of how our students and ourselves immigrate to where we come from, like, we have to understand the pushes. They named the push for Palestinians. And to have stories of Palestinians in their own words, including, for instance, pieces of art, of culture, for instance, a song by a Palestinian artist, Shadia Mansour, with Arabic lyrics that were deemed anti-Semitic by mainstream Jewish Zionist institutions like the Jewish Community Relations Council, JPAC, the Jewish Public Action Committee, the ADL, Stand With Us. We could keep listing them. The pushback was immense, and without being able to get through all of the back and forth over 18 months of revisions and public comment, the final draft that was just approved by the California Department of Education in March 2021, just about 2 months ago, had very little to no Palestine content in it in its final draft. There was one line about Palestinian Americans accepting that they lived in the US, saying they're here, we acknowledge they exist. And there was one short story in the single Arab American Studies module lesson that was allowed in. There were originally 4. All of those originals were removed and only one was allowed in, a new one that acknowledged that a student who faced an Islamophobic attack at school was Palestinian. We can talk more about why Palestine became, essentially there are fights against ethnic studies around the country writ large. And we've heard all these boogeymen about critical race theory. Anyone who's been, well, maybe if you don't watch Fox News yourself, you've seen that Fox News is talking about this. Why is critical race theory being demonized as a whole? And why is the fact that particularly that ethnic studies as a field has always stood with and for Palestinians, and Palestinians themselves have always been part of ethnic studies, why that has become the fracture point? We can talk more about that.
Mm-hmm. In the talk that I saw you at USC, there was an interesting discussion about Edward Said and even just Arab and Palestinian issues being categorized as Asian, right? Or even Jewish issues being categorized as Asian, which was strange. I think it was brought up. But also this notion of this is Armenian Americans, Jewish Americans that are more maybe Zionistic, are concerned about their histories being written out of the California curriculum or not being represented correctly in the curriculum. So how California is very diverse and has all these different, political ideologies and so on and so forth in terms of identities. How does one effectively create a curriculum that, can you serve all groups? Because when you tell the, like the Sacagawea story, it's like, it's not Disney. It's like there was actually someone who was being oppressed and a group that was being heavily harmed and displaced. So how do we do this? How do we do this dance of, satisfying all parties involved when writing an ethnic studies or just a history curriculum?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I'll cover that in the first part, which was kind of a question about the weird geographies of this. I'll cover the second one first, and then when we can go back to the geography question. So ethnic studies in its name is itself a bit of a misnomer, and you have scholars and historians of the field, for instance, Roderick Ferguson, who points out that when ethnic studies was institutionalized in universities, what people were calling for was liberation studies. They were calling for an analysis of imperialism and colonialism. And the only way you could analyze that was from the stories of communities of color who have had and are living through the oppression of those systems, because dominant systems are not themselves interested in interrogating their issues. Very rarely, if ever, you're going to find someone who's in power that's like, yes, please tell me why what I'm doing is wrong. So it's a question of positionality, of the kind of Black feminist question of the standpoint, which is where I'm standing from. I can very clearly see why what's going on is messed up, right? When they were institutionalized into universities, it very quickly became about representation and diversity, because calls that were rightfully so, calls to, for instance, hire Black faculty and admit more Black students, hire Native faculty to teach these classes and have Native students, so that we are, they were telling their own stories. That then very clearly became like, even if we can have the representation, but like, is the critical analysis going to be there? Because it would threaten the very institutional structure that people were being integrated and assimilated into. And you see that really ramp up in the kind of like multicultural 90s, like rise of diversity. And particularly after affirmative action was outlawed in California, you have the fact that now, okay, we can't actually have affirmative action diversity hiring of faculty or of admissions of students. And so it very much kind of really starts to get watered down. What I heard from educators, students, those who wrote this curriculum in California, the biggest heartbreak was how what was originally a curriculum that allowed students, no matter their background, to enter and find themselves in it, had been watered down into a question of, has every head been counted? Ethnic studies at its strengths gives every student, no matter who they are, including white students, the power to critically analyze the narratives that they've been given and ask what's really going on here. Ethnic studies at its strengths allows me as a white Jew to understand what that means. What is my racial position in the world? How has it come to be that way? What are my obligations? Is this how I want the world to look in the future? Whether or not I see myself or someone who looks like me as the story in the curriculum, right? Like, it's a very important feminist ethic to learn across difference and to be able to work across difference, right? And so this question of every seat at the table, it's not to downplay the fact that there is also a major issue where, for instance, Arab Americans have had little to no representation in the curriculum other than mentions of terrorism, or occasionally in, say, like a 6th grade world cultures class, you get like an Islam unit, which again, not all Arabs are Muslim, and not all Muslims are Arab, right? So the question of representation does still matter in terms of, can Palestinians, can Arab Americans, can any community tell their own stories? Of course. But what the original curriculum set out to do, and what those who are still fighting, I should say, not to just because the CDE, the Department of Ed, passed that curriculum doesn't mean that the fight is over, because it now moves to the local level. critical race and ethnic studies with emphasis on the critical gives our youth and us as teachers the critical analysis skills to unpack systems of power and to ask, how did the world come to be the way that it is? And is this the world that we still want to live in for peace and justice for everyone in the future?
So whew, that's a lot. You're giving it to us, and it's good. Liberation studies, maybe that would have been more authentic to what's actually trying to be accomplished here. And I'm thinking about California, and thinking about how I learned my fourth grade curriculum of the gold rush that I was just like, well, there was these, white folks, and they were doing this, and that's pretty cool with the pan, and they're getting the gold. And like we went to Knott's Berry Farm, and like we were doing it too. And like, whoa, cool. If you got gold, this is great. Not too much about the displacement of Native American folks, not too much about 1 in 4 cowboys were Black, not too much about the complicated history of Spain colonizing, and then Mexico fighting for its freedom in 1821, and then the trickiness of Mexico actually then oppressing indigenous folks in certain ways, right, and pushing them out. And then the missions, sheesh, right, the missions, like, and now we're having this, thank God for my parents who were, I'm doing San Rafael mission because it was the easiest one to draw. And I think it was, my father who was like, we don't draw concentration camps, and I don't know if this is so good. How do we do it? How are we rewriting California's history to be more honest? And the thing that I'm quickly learning, people don't like honesty. People don't like the truth because it hurts. It's messy. Our human experience is very messy. How do we be honest, and how do we do this thing with also not sacrificing our morals or our principles of what happened?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that example of the missions, because I think that that's actually a really, really critical example of how learning across difference is something that still can be important for our world. I heard Corinna Gold, who's an Ohlone leader here in the Bay Area, speak. First time I heard her speak was in the mission in San Francisco at the Women's Building. And she opened by, saying what it was like for her to walk past where her ancestors were imprisoned. And she's like, it's like if you lived down the street from a concentration camp and had to walk, not just a concentration camp, but a concentration camp that had been turned into a specific type of museum that celebrated the Nazis. And I've been to the death camps. My first trip to Israel was after a week in Poland, touring the death camps with my Jewish youth group. And I viscerally was like, yeah, I would rightfully be outraged. I did not have to have a metaphor to understand solidarity in that moment, although it helps, but to just say, it's like, understand across peoples who have experienced genocide, the importance of educating about the genocide of Native Americans and of California Indians in particular. Some amazing colleagues of mine at Davis, like Caitlin Reed, who's now a professor up at Humboldt State, really recommend you check out her work, has a great piece out recently about the need to understand what has happened to California Indians as a genocide. And that kind of honesty, we have Gavin Newsom, who has recently apologized in the past few years publicly. And there's the forming of a Truth and Reconciliation Committee for California around California Indian genocide. That recognition is not itself, this comes back to what we started the conversation about. Recognition is not the same thing. So the question of how do we build our curriculums, I think that this is the chance for educators who are listening to take the state resources that are given, right? The ethnic studies model curriculum, for instance, which incorporates some of this, is an attempt to try to do better, or at least it was. And there's still some parts of it. This is not to say that there's nothing salvageable or still worthwhile understanding from that curriculum, but to use that as a jumping off point to have the tough conversations with each other to say, what of California's past are the things that we need to carry forward into the future, and what are the things that we need to learn as the lessons to caution against what we need in the future, or to caution against the types of injustices that we would like to leave in the past and not keep repeating in our world. Yeah, it's tough. I think that the challenges that K through 12 educators, to name them in particular, have against things like curriculum standards is particularly tricky, in which there's not always a huge amount of freedom of what to teach. But as much as one can find freedom within that, to say, I've been given the standard to teach about this, how can I seek out examples and lessons that will still fit that standard, but will tell a different story? I think that there's increasingly community groups that are absolutely there to help with that.
So many things I want to hit upon. This is really dope. Okay, so like community gardens, tell us a little bit about, like, is it Tuolumne River Trust? Because I'm
the environmental justice work,
yeah. I think, and then you have the garden enrichment coordinator. Like, I'm thinking about let's say I'm a student that comes from a wealthy neighborhood. My parents maybe are very conservative, and I'm thrown into this classroom, and it's like, whoa, this is super. I'm thrown into this garden, right? And I'm like, this is super different. I'm a little bit uncomfortable, but I'm open to it. And also, these folks are talking a lot about white supremacy, and they're talking about, maybe I feel like the bad person. How do you walk through those issues of whether it be defensiveness or, the privileged white student is feeling left out, or these types of things? And how do we, if it's supposed to be liberation work, help even those at the top of the pyramid understand that their lives will be better and they will be more liberated when everybody's lives is more liberated?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you brought up the kind of question of like learning in place, which is what I would call the kind of environmental education work that I've done and continue to do, is like learning not just about the place that you're in and like learning and like studying it and examining it, but learning with the place that you're in. And I think that when you learn with place, that quite clearly shows how everyone has a stake in collective liberation. And it's not just helping those people who aren't free yet get free. The place that we live in California has had a time of it. We are facing down another mega drought. It has been a weird spring up here in the Bay Area, like weird weather-wise. It has felt like LA. And I've been disconcerted at the warmth. And now we finally got the fog. I was missing the fog. I was like actually deeply upset it hadn't been foggy, that the marine layer I thought like disappeared. I was worried it was gone forever. That's coming off of what I don't need to tell any Californians, but also anyone else who's listening. Historic wildfires that broke the previous historic wildfires that broke the previous historic wildfires. And these kind of current days of what we might call like almost a present day dystopia or of climate injustices are very deeply specific to our place and globally connected. Any person lives through the fact that global systems of extractive capitalism and systems of racial capitalism lead to destructions of our natural environments that everyone will suffer. We don't suffer them equally. So I had the ability to hide inside for essentially 8 weeks and not leave the house during the smoke last summer, and have well-sealed windows and be able to, have a very good grocery store within a short walk from my house. So I didn't have to expose myself that much. While, families in East Oakland with 100-year-old houses with no ventilation who had to keep going to work every day in the middle of COVID and wildfires, are exposing lungs that have already been damaged through things like lead poisoning, right? Working class families of color. So that's not to say that we won't all experience them. We will not all experience those effects equally. But I would say that students from privileged backgrounds absolutely still have a stake in fighting for a world that they can grow up and be healthy in, and that if they want kids, that their future kids grow up and be healthy in, right? Because the other alternative is building to me, the alternatives of building barricaded off areas to protect the wealthy few are not only are they unjust, but they're unsustainable. Like, we don't actually want to live in a Hunger Games world. Even if you were the ones in the Capitol, no one actually wants that to be the world that we end up in. I genuinely think maybe a very small number of like comic book villain type people, but like our students don't want that, regardless of their background. They really don't. They read these, right? There's a reason that so many young adult fictions are about dystopias, and then they read them and they're like, oh yeah, I get it. No, that's not the world I want to live in, right? And so I would say that it's that question when a white student, and I have been that white student. I am still a student, and I am still often that person. And I'm like, okay, let me stop and ask, like, is this really about me? Or is this about building for a world in which like I can be happier and healthier and safer because others are? And it's hard though. And I would say that there's different ways that, going back to learning in place, if you're able to have these types of lessons, particularly with, I would say like high schoolers and middle schoolers, in a setting in which they have time to like sit and reflect and catch their breath. All students need that, whether it's because something in the lesson brought up personal or collective trauma for them, or whether it because they can have that time to cool down that defensive reaction. I believe, as the youth say on Twitter, go touch some grass. Like, if there's a value in being able to have that space to breathe and say, okay, this isn't actually about attacking me. This is actually going to make my life better and healthier if we can really get there together. But it's tough. And it's, when you're in the moment and that lizard brain turns on, it is really where you have the space to like, let yourself calm that down, is really valuable.
So let's go there for a minute. And I love that, touch the grass, because I've been having some conversations with my very close friends about, when we do justice and equity work, because diversity work, I think, is what you're talking about in the 90s, right? Hopefully it's a progression here from diversity to inclusion to justice. Hopefully it's a scaled thing. Right. And diversity is go ahead.
I would say, I believe now, like at least a lot of my colleagues, for instance, who do this work in environmental, now JEDI is a preferred word. Justice is the first letter. Have we said JEDI? So J being the first letter as justice is like leading with that. It's also nice. I can remember that because I'm like, oh, Jedi, like in Star Wars. But yeah, like the question of, leading to it or leading from it. Yeah.
I like that. I'm gonna borrow that. When we talk about Jedi work, you and I are coming from a certain place, and I think you and I vibe, and we're on the same like energy length, right? Wavelength. I think we don't talk enough, and this is the collective we, when we do Jedi work, about the mind, body, spirit connection. Touching grass is literally like grounding yourself, looking at the trees. How are you feeling right now? Someone just said white supremacy. Someone just said black and brown oppression. Someone just said, BIPOC, and we talk about the difference between POC and BIPOC. We throw around these words that are usually generated in academia and then kind of like promulgated throughout social media. And then people are like, okay, cool. Like, that's the new word, I should use it. And it's like racially coded, and also like whatever. I guess sometimes folks like us, like white Jewish intellectual folks, like, okay, like this is the thing. But the more I'm realizing this stuff is people are like, how do you, not always up here, but like, how are you feeling here? And this is going against my kind of like natural state, because I'm like, I don't know, just like read a book, think about it.
Well, I would say that this is where, like, again, there's a little bit of an insider baseball thing. Like, as a Jew, like, we are the people of the book. Like, I like reading. I sometimes joke that if I could just be a brain in the jar, I would. Like, if I could get, this is actually doesn't come naturally to me. I'm not someone that gets super in touch with getting grounded through the body. This is not how I actually prefer to just be like writing and reading and like pretending to turn off that I have bodily needs entirely, and I have to remember to drink water and things like that. But I think that that's first of all, that's something that like I was taught growing up and that I'm trying to unlearn and to accept how those types of defense mechanisms like are trying to protect me, but like when are they not serving me anymore? And I think our students are being taught those mechanisms, and so they hopefully have shorter to go to unlearn them if you can kind of get them before they're deeply entrenched into like full coping mechanisms, but to instead help like name them as they're getting rooted. And then I think second too is to like have students connect with each other and teachers connect with each other, because ultimately I think one of the most toxic things about our education culture and part of whatever, there's multiple cultures in America, but American culture is intensely individualistic, right? We know this. Everyone is taught individually to get ahead, to succeed. Myths of meritocracy that I know that you have talked about. And what that means is that in a moment, for instance, not only when we stop and get in touch with our own bodies, but we look around and we see like, oh, this thing that like maybe felt hurtful to me or triggered defensiveness in me is making my good friend and classmate cry because she's never gotten to hear her story told like this. And I think that like what matters to me and the reason that I, for instance, got involved in the fight for Arab American studies at all is because Palestinian and Arab friends of mine, it so matters to them to be able to tell their families' stories. And as a teacher who, you know, hopes to teach history of Israel Palestine in the future, it matters to me that those students in my classes feel welcome and safe as well. And that can be, then it's like when you make a place that's safe for them, it is a place that can be safe for everyone, you know? So it's actually also not allowing students to get segmented off from each other and making it be an either or. It's us or them. If I'm safe, you're not, and vice versa. And it's hard when sometimes institutions aren't always that great at supporting that. But again, I think it's when it's a question of finding the resources where you can to support each other and starting to teach students to be there for each other in that type of collective care that we're going to need to survive the world that we live in. I think that comes through, yeah, definitely like kind of taking a deep breath in the body. But it also is about looking out for each other.
Right. So I'm hearing, you know, my conservative friends in my head that a critique of, you know, the progressive left is like, we're always talking about the world that could be, and we're trying to get there, right? If you could see a type of promised land, maybe we can all get there together. And I do believe in that. I am learning that some conservative folks would say, yeah, that's naive, that's great, that's nice. But we live in racialized capitalism. And if I'm going to be a good parent, I'm going to teach them racialized capitalism because they need to learn how to sink or swim. And if you break the law, you go to jail. It's nice if we're going to try to like do some restorative justice stuff in jail, maybe. But I don't know. I just want my kid to get all the goodies and get into college and get the good job and get a partner and have kids and do the whole thing over again. What do you tell those parents who are very scared, anxious, and have not read all these books that you and I have read, you know, How to Be an Anti-Racist and White Fragility? I'm not fragile. I just want to teach them the world is unfair and it's capitalistic and this is what we got to do. And maybe I come from a country that was really messed up. I got screwed over. Now I'm here. We're not going to get screwed over again. What do you tell to those parents?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm not yet a parent myself, and so it's always hard for me to right now. What I'm picturing is my niece who's almost 2 years old, my Jewish Mexican niece who is, you know, herself going to grow up as a Jew of color and is going to need love and support from her Jewish friends of all races. And so I would hope that, you know, parents of children that she's going to be with would want to love and support, have her having a loving, supportive community as well. I think that this comes back to what I was saying for collective care. I think that what critical race and ethnic studies teaches us about whiteness is that every generation has been offered a racial bribe. Every generation of white people has been offered a bribe that says, if you keep quiet about white supremacy, you're going to get some benefit in return. And that bribe is the strongest for white working class people in terms of the history of, if you don't unite with Black working class people to get better conditions, we're going to give you a couple more scraps. But the white racial bribe that my parents' generation have around, if you move out to the suburbs and if you keep quiet, you'll get a nice house in Long Island, you'll have some comfort. And my generation's being offered that racial bribe again. Leave behind your progressive values. When your kid has to go into school, you should pick them the best school that you can. Don't make your kid be a guinea pig for your own flag waving stuff. And I think at some point, like, we collectively have to say we're refusing that bribe. We collectively are going to trust that we can take care of each other, that it's not about an individual hoarding of wealth and safety, but it's about community care. And it's not to then, like, again, it kind of, everyone wants to go down to extreme examples, but I do genuinely believe people want to be good, and that they're looking for ways to be good, and they're not needing to be punished out of doing bad. And so I think it's imagining what this, it doesn't actually, when we say we imagine the world in the future, I'm actually imagining the world right now. Like, I'm imagining, for instance, in Oakland, where recently the recent de-escalation by community groups prevented the need for police violence against a Black man who was having a mental breakdown in his car, and community groups led by Cat Brooks were able to bring a mental health responder and his mom on site and got him out because he had a gun in the car. And that easily could have ended with his shooting by police, by Oakland PD. That's a now thing. That's not some distant utopian future, right? When I think about this, schools my future children will go to, I want them to be good schools. And the way that they're good schools is by supporting good schools for all students, not just for my kids, right? So I think it's about making those collective commitments together now. That's why I think ethnic studies matters in terms of, from a curriculum standpoint, making that commitment to all of California's students. This isn't about some experimental thing. This is about saying together, we want to teach our students about a better world as possible now as well, like in our lifetimes. And I think that that's tricky, and I think that there will be mistakes along the way, and not everything's perfect. But I don't think that it's not a pipe dream. We've seen changes in our lifetimes already, and our parents' generation's lifetimes, and those changes were also seen as impossible and far-fetched. And so I think actually what a lot of things being demanded right now are actually comparatively very small and very doable.
What would you tell, oh, thank you. What would you tell to, I'm thinking about like Bonilla Silva's kind of racial hierarchy in America, right? So you have like this white, honorary white, and collective Black on a pyramid. There's a lot of stuff in the news about Asian Americans being hated on, brutalized, and we're seeing all these videos and it's terrible. What do you say? Well, I think maybe two parts. In ethnic studies, how can we like represent groups that are not part of the historic privileged white class that are kind of in the middle? Like how do we get those? Not everybody's an honorary white, right? But groups that don't fall between collective whiteness and collective Blackness. What do you say to like Persian communities, Asian American communities, South Asian communities that are like, hey, I'm not being offered a white bribe because I'm not that. I believe in this idea of America, and stop trying to tell me there's a myth of meritocracy, that society is unfair. I'm playing by the rules and I'm doing it right, and stop trying to change these systems. Yeah, what do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is that I'm not going to answer your question maybe as directly as you would like me to, but I'll answer it in a different way. A couple of things for some of those communities. Actually, I would really recommend one resource that comes out of UC Davis, a student-run media called the Other Collective. They are a South Asian, Middle Eastern, and Southeast Asian media collective that writes from their own experiences as international students, as first generation born in the US, kind of working through these questions, these exact ones of like, how do we as young South Asian Americans, Iranian Americans, Arab Americans, like, what do we see as the world we want to live in? And I would say that they're just doing a really great job of it. And I have the honor of mentoring one of their editors. And so I just like can't recommend their work enough. They're on Instagram and they have a website and they had a nice issue kind of you can read for free online. What I would, and that, what? The Other Collective.
Okay. Thank you.
At UC Davis. And I wouldn't, and what I would say is that they have a really good analysis of that question of it's not about whether they're getting a racial bribe or definitively not white, but yet how they still are criticizing these systems of power nonetheless. What I would say also is that this essentially, there's a wonderful poem from Aurora Levins Morales, who is a wonderful member of my synagogue here, Kehillah Jewish Synagogue, amazing Jewish Puerto Rican native poet for anyone who don't know her. And the quote, which again, I'm really not doing well with quotes today, from her poem, Ve'ahavta, like, no more taking turns. Oh, I looked it up. So there we go. Now I'll actually get it right. No more taking turns on history's wheel, trying to collect old debts no one can pay. The sea will not open that way. So like, rather than everyone trying to rush to see if they can get to the top of the ladder, and like, even if we have to stand on other people's backs on the way to get there, but just asking like, can that wheel be broken, rather than taking turns on it. And I think that her work really kind of shows that question of, we will have to get there together, and not just taking turns at being oppressed or oppressor.
Amen to that. Amen. So I know we got to wrap up soon, but tell me, where you're doing the geography PhD, where are you going, and what is the vision of whatever, I don't know, silly question, but like 5 to 10 years, like where do you want to be, and what do you want to see?
That's a good question to end on. Where I would like to be personally, I would like to be in California. I'd like to be working with other educators and students to build kind of sustainable systems, being able to like teach about the issues that I care about, whether that's in a college classroom or in other settings. 5 to 10 years from now, I don't say this flippantly, like I hope that I live in a livable California. Like, I'm not willing to leave here. I think every year my friends are it's more and more anxious in terms of cost of living going up and wildfires and climate change and everything like that. And like, I want to stay and fight for a place that is not my sovereign ancestral homeland, but is nonetheless a place that has held me as home my whole life. And I think that it is possible to do that. And I think that like the fight to continue good public education in California, good environmental justice work in California, and the way that that connects internationally around the world, because we live California has always been an international place. It's home to over 150 different California Indian nations. It is inherently international, and then let alone those who have found this place to be a place of refuge and or descendants of settlers who took this land by force. It is still international. And so the question of like what it means to be part of an international California 10 years in the future, I hope it's even that way and even more so, but maybe with better, more just systems in place so that everyone gets their boat floated rather than just a select elite few.
What advice, I like that a lot. What advice would you give K through 16 educators who, I don't know, are trying to embark on this Jedi work, and maybe are trying to like do a community garden, or trying to like talk about local environmental racism, or just, you know, from I mean, I think some viewers like, whoa, how do we do Jedi work in K-6? That seems really, really difficult, because I don't want to traumatize my students and tell them about like Black Holocaust and like Native American genocide, or like, how do we do it starting from a young age? Well,
Yeah, I mean, first I would say, and this came up, there was a great moment in one of the ethnic studies public hearings on Zoom, in which one of the teachers who was on the kind of instructional quality commission pointed out that like our youth are the ones who are coming up with a lot of these terms. And to explain the world around them and the systems of injustice. Like we say that they originate in academia, but like they're coming up with understandings of the world, and they're coming up from it at a young age. Like we know that very young children, sadly, actually start to learn and internalize questions of difference that they're taught. And that's why we need things like kids being able to play with like lots of different toys and read books from lots of different authors, even before they can actually read the words on the page, right? And so I think it's about like obviously being age appropriate in terms of like not wanting to like intentionally scar a child, but it's also about trusting that like kids notice more than we give them credit for. And if you give them the space to like process before and after, these things like are things that either not only can they handle knowing, a lot of them know this. Like a lot of children are come from families or themselves are survivors of war, of imperial war, and have had to learn these things at much too young of an age. Is not to then say we should subject other children to violence. No, not to say that, but it's to say that like youth can do more often, like this kind of save the children ethos that I think a lot of people have is actually a lot more about we don't want to have the difficult conversations with them when they bring up questions that are uncomfortable for us, right? Because if you've ever been with a kid, particularly one that's under the age of 10, they ask incredibly uncomfortable questions, right? And that's more about us and our discomfort and wanting to have that difficult conversation with a child than it is about what they can and cannot handle at an age appropriate age, right? And so I think it's about allowing ourselves also to go touch grass and to have to lean into that discomfort and to not run away from it. And you know, and there's a lot of good tools out there to do that. But I think it's also about naming, is it because I want to protect the kid, or it's because I want to protect myself from having to interrogate these systems personally?
Parents need to touch grass and hug a tree as well. I love that. I'm gonna do like a little toss-up question here, and you can like pick either or combine the two. The first question is there anything that you didn't get to say that you really are like, dude, we should have talked about this, or I just want to put this plug in, or like, I also want to, people should think about this. It's number one. Number two, as we close out, like Community Works Institute is all about having, like giving students like a notepad and like a camera and sending them out into, you know, society with a guardian, right? If they're little kids. And like getting people's stories and learning about who's on the block and like, what's the firefighter, what's the police officer, like, what's the homeless person doing? Like, what's the lawyer, what's like the community activist or organizer doing? And what you're talking about, instead of having the Benedict Anderson imagined community, it's like, no, this is actually the real community. I'm hearing it and I'm feeling it. This is great. Because the second question is like, with the Tuolumne River project, or with like the community garden, like with this, give us like an example of something kind of transformative that you saw, like a little story of like someone, a fourth or fifth grader that you worked with, that like, it was like a light bulb moment. It was like, oh my God, like this is how this education could work. So I'm going to throw that either or combine those two questions.
Yeah, I guess the things we didn't get to talk about, which isn't really, we did get to talk about them, but just wanting to end on the note of shouting out the Save Arab American Studies Coalition, if people want to keep in touch with that work that's still ongoing. So just to like directly plug them, because they are really the organizers. I am, again, myself, just an observer. And to say that there's resources available for that. And then the second thing, unfortunately, I think what I have is a sad story and not a light bulb moment. I'm sorry about that. And it's the kind of, to me, it was a moment that made me want to go back and do the research to kind of build things better, because I realized that just implementation wasn't enough. When I worked, we took a field trip of students from Bayview out in San Francisco, like a school that was 95% students of color, if not more, to the Tuolumne River in Modesto to see where their drinking water comes from. And we had a really nice time. A lot of them had never like been to a place like that out in nature. And mostly they didn't really listen to the lessons. They just wanted to skip rocks. And I was like, that's cool. I'll just skip rocks. That sounds great. And unfortunately, on our way out to the bus, police were arresting a man who was like in the public restrooms there. And there was like a domestic dispute. And the kids kind of had to watch this like pretty intense police interaction happen like feet away from where the bus was. There's no real way. Again, there's no way to hide it from them. These were 4th through 6th graders. And these were 4th through 6th graders who had already seen police on their block their whole life. So their experience was that, which was actually, that was the thing that was incredibly familiar to them. That was not the thing that was like foreign and scary. The river was actually a much like bigger, weirder thing. They're like, is it okay? Like, can we stand near? Like, and that the police interaction, like, which for me was actually like quite jarring, for them, unfortunately, was horribly routine. And to me, that thing of like, why is it that the act of violence is the thing that is routine for a 4th grader, but sitting and throwing a rock into a river is the thing that's like special and almost scary, like, because this kind of body of water, you don't know what it's going to do. And so asking like, in the future, wouldn't we want it to be the other way around, that acts of violence are rare and uncommon and not routine for our students, and particularly for our students of color? And that things like standing at a river and skipping rocks with your friends is like a beautiful thing that you can do anytime.
That is what we're going to leave on, because that's a mic drop moment that encapsulates everything that we're talking about, the need for ethnic studies or liberation curriculum, because that is where we're trying to get to, where the river is familiar and beautiful, and one can skip rocks and know the fishies and the plants, and just it's home. And then the police brutality is rare and is like, what is that? And people are outraged by it rather than adjusted to the injustice, as Cornel West would say. Gabby Kirk, this has been a beautiful conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zach.
Yeah, this has been really cool. Hang out for a minute. I'm just going to close out our audience here. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Community Works Institute, communityworksinstitute.org. Please check them out. Professional development opportunities, cool story sharing moments like this with a bunch of other artists, activists, intellectuals, book lovers, poem lovers, a bunch of different people, artists. You're going to be impressed and you're going to enjoy yourself. And hopefully your students are going to learn something. So please go check them out, communityworksinstitute.org. Thank you, Joe Brooks, for letting me utilize this space. And Gabby, soon to be Dr. Kirk. Let's keep pushing.
Absolutely.
Thank
you both so much.
It would be a better place with this, what you're bringing to the table. So thank you for doing what you do. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you both so much.
All right, everybody. Have a beautiful day. Take care. Peace.